So the cover is just Marshdale and Salt Springs, two gas plants, 25 years, and just some questions to ask, worth asking before Nova Scotia commits. And so what's on the table is two gas plants. And when I say gas, they're really dual fuel capable. So they're going to run on either natural gas or diesel. And there's two plants, 600 megawatts total. So it'd be 300 megawatt each plant. And as you can see by the map, they're really only about 16 kilometers apart. So we can't say that they're in the same watershed area. They're not. The way the geography is they drip toward either the West River at the top or the East River at the bottom. They go like this. They don't combine, but. And so they expect them to be in service till around 2030, and the commitment is going to be at least for 25 years. And that's significant because obviously it locks us into a fossil fuel commitment for 25 years. But when asked whether they could go with a slower, like a 10 or 15-year commitment, we were told that nobody would bid on those because they're not economically viable. So that's why it's a 25-year commitment. And we'll see later that the tolling agreement provides for both capacity payments. So they get paid to have that 600 megawatt capacity available every month. And then they also get paid when they actually generate power. But that's in a later slide. So the three questions that we think Nova Scotia should ask before these get built are, what does it put at risk on the land? Was this decided the right way? And is gas really the cheapest path? And so very quickly, what's at risk on the land are three bat species, all endangered: mainland moose, black ash, wild Atlantic salmon, Canada warbler, and Stellarton's drinking water is part of the watershed for the Marshdale plant. The reason that's interesting for Stellarton is that part of the diesel fuel requirement is that they store up to 5 days worth of running time in diesel on site. And so what that means is there'll be 9 million liters of diesel stored in probably 3 distributed tanks on site at these plants. The salmon are particularly interesting because there's been a lot of work lately on rebuilding the West River and the East River. They're both prime salmon habitats. Nova Scotia, I'm not an angler, but I'm told we have 10 good salmon rivers and 2 of them are in Pictou County. So, it's pretty significant that these are the 2 that may be affected. Another thing to note about what's at risk on the land is that because these things were rushed, they had to rush to get them in before a particular deadline for the environmental assessment. They didn't actually do any field studies. A lot of this monitoring is desktop modeling, where they run some simulations on a computer and then call it square. And of course, we know that that's not sufficient. You actually have to go out and look for these things rather than just, relying on computer modeling. Sorry, I jumped ahead of my slide. This is the slide that talks about how much of it was never studied. There were no field surveys for any of the bat species, no surveys designed to detect mainland moose. And a lot of the actual studies were deferred until after the approval. So they call these part of the approval conditions for the environmental assessment approval. And so groundwater field study. What's interesting about this is that most recently, the IESO, who's the proponent who are building these plants, had to pivot and say that they'd move away from a water guzzling technology to a dry technology. And the reason they did this is because they actually went and did the field studies and couldn't find water. So had they done the studies beforehand, like they should have, they could have avoided all the water controversy entirely. What's really, really frustrating about that is that they came out and said that due to community feedback, they've decided to change their water plan, which of course is not true. It's because they didn't have the water, but they chose to take that PR route. So one of the other environmental concerns, and you've alluded to this as part of your fracking thing, is that these gas plants will create a domestic need for fracking. So right now, Nova Scotia has some natural gas. It comes up the pipeline. We're at the end of the pipeline. So The gas we get is when everybody else has had a chance, and it's usually very expensive by the time gas gets through all of the other consumers, by the time it gets to Nova Scotia, unless you reserve it. And we don't have a domestic source of natural gas, which is great, or a storage facility for natural gas. So those two things, the lack of those two things creates a domestic need when these gas plants come online. So what's projected for usage is about 1.5 times Nova Scotia's current natural gas usage. So if we're struggling to get gas now, if we almost double that, we're going to be very in a whole lot of trouble trying to secure that much supply, which again will make the case for domestic gas fracking. So we think it's all really related. Is the latest resource extractive push with these plants creating a need, and it's all very cyclical in reasoning and argument, but you know, the borders that they stand on really don't hold any argument. So I'm just looking back through my slides. One of the very important things to note for health impacts is that these are projected to run on the coldest winter days. They're supposed to provide backup power during cold snaps. And that's when natural gas is the least available to Nova Scotia. And so what we think will happen is they'll probably end up running on the coldest days on diesel, which is, other than coal, the least, or the least clean way that you can produce electricity. It's one step above coal in terms of particulate and emissions. So the reason that's important is that during the coldest days of the year, the air is very heavy and it stays very close to the ground. And so we expect there to be a lot more particulate issues than they've currently modeled, because they modeled natural gas, but not diesel in terms of particulate. So what they've shown for their emission controls is based on natural gas and not diesel, but we think it's probably going to be running diesel. So that's what the emission controls should have been modeled against. Right. And so these plants were essentially, when I started looking at this, I asked myself, okay, what's the rush? Like, why do these things have to be built now? And why are we building 2 of them? The original Nova Scotia power plan called for 1 plant, but we're potentially building 2. We're putting out proposals for 2 plants before 2030. And the reason is that if they hit a series of milestones, they qualify as what's called a planned unit. And that planned unit designation gives them an exemption from CO2 limits under the new federal clean energy regulations until 2049. So if these plants qualify as planned units, then they'll have a CO2 exemption for the next 25, almost 30 years of the plant lifetime. And if they don't qualify as planned units, then Nova Scotia won't be able to run them as often as they say they're going to need to, because they'd be beyond the federal emission limits. And so one of those milestones was having their environmental assessment not approved, but at least just filed before December 31st, 2025. And they hit that deadline by 9 days. They waited until December 22nd to get it done. And the reason a lot of the desktop modeling was required and they didn't actually do the surveys was because they ran out of time to do the surveys. So they didn't have time to actually do the field studies before they had to have these things filed for an environmental assessment. So it blows my mind that we're using clean energy regulations to justify building new methane plants. Like, the logic of that makes no sense to me. And so I've alluded to this earlier, but one of the things that we're pointing out is that the 600 megawatt that they've said they've needed is way more than what the plan originally called for. So the planning goes all the way back to 2023, when Nova Scotia Power identified that they probably need 150 megawatts of fast-acting natural gas generation. And since then, with no additional modeling, the ISO has crept that number up steadily. You know, it became 450 megawatt, and then now it's 600 megawatt. So what we're saying is that the modeling to justify the 600 megawatts has never been done. and that really they need to do additional modeling using today's technology choices to really come up with what the actual need is for 2026. So the line I've been using is that we're building gas plants based on a 2023 plan in 2026 when technologies have changed. So the answers to these three questions require a better alternative. What does this put at risk on the land, endangered species, habitat on site? Was this decided the right way? We say no, this was all rushed to beat a federal deadline. This was filed before the builder was chosen. So one of the discrepancies in this procurement versus past and prior is that there's no proponent listed. Previously, if somebody wanted to come and build a power plant in Nova Scotia, they would come with a plan in hand and they would say, we've done the community assessment, we've done the impact assessments, this is our plan, this is what we think we should build. That didn't happen in this case because they had to have it done quickly. So they didn't have an actual proponent. So the IESO submitted it. And what that means is that we really don't know until they select a proponent exactly what's going to be built. It's all up in the air. So the environmental assessment was approved without a building plan, without an actual physical plant specification, or any of these other things that you would think you'd have to have before you give an environmental assessment. So this is why this is very, very strange in terms of how Nova Scotia goes about buying power. And then is gas really the cheapest path? We've seen, and again, this is the argument I make as 2026 technology and numbers versus 2023, is that in 2023, batteries were very expensive relative to gas. And over the last 3 years, we've seen battery costs fall almost 200%. So right now they represent almost half as much as what it would cost to build a new gas plant. So when you look at it on a graph, gas prices are coming down while battery prices are coming down while gas plant prices are going up. And we've already hit that X crossing point. And so I don't think it's possible to say anymore in 2026 that gas is really the cheapest path. They haven't done the new modeling with the new battery numbers. Nova Scotia is relying on their 2023 battery numbers, where, to be honest, they really got ripped off. So they've been saying that this is what it cost us in 2023, so this is what we think it's going to cost us in 2026. When there's been new market announcements, one of the most important ones was Ontario's recent procurement, where they let gas and batteries compete on an even playing field, and they took 6 battery projects and no gas projects because the batteries were that much cheaper. So I've already mentioned it. We think that the better alternative is battery storage, and that's currently lithium ion at an 8-hour duration. So Nova Scotia has batteries on the grid right now. They're 100 megawatt, 4-hour batteries. And last year's January 26th grid peak, the batteries performed flawlessly. So, you know, they're a demonstrated solution. Nova Scotia Power and the IESO says they won't work here because they don't last long enough. And so what we've argued is that 8-hour batteries more than cover our peak, and that if we simply push a couple of procurement decisions down the road, there's technology called iron air batteries and long duration storage that would last up to a week. And so rather than locking us into 25 years of peakers, we could make changes to our existing thermal fleet that would allow us to extend things slightly and allow long duration storage battery tech to catch up and not have to buy the peakers. We'd be able to, what I call it is the great leap. Because we've taken so long to buy these peakers, battery technology has caught up, and now we could just leap over them straight to battery tech. So that's really our argument. And the last point, oh, right, built in stages and the need is proven backed by the existing fleet. One of the other things we're arguing as well is that the 3 grids in the Atlantic region, Nova Scotia, PEI, and New Brunswick, one of their prime directives is that they are locally sufficient. And what that means is that each province needs to be able to generate its own power without an intertie to another province. On its face, that's probably not a bad idea, but it really doesn't make economic sense for, as you know, pretty near anything benefits from economies of scale. So one of the arguments we've been making is for what we call a maritime integrator that would be able to look at all three grids as a comprehensive whole, and then be able to move power amongst them through interties and things like that, that would make it not. One of the big things we could do is take Quebec Hydro down through New Brunswick and then distribute that out through the other two operators, which would allow us to both green our grids using hydro and make it so that we wouldn't have to build peakers. So yeah, this is a graph that just shows the battery cost. And there was three recent results. Prince Edward Island, they had their regulator commission a study that again recommended batteries as an alternative to a 100 megawatt gas peaker over there. I mentioned the Ontario 640 megawatt of 8-hour storage, no gas. And Enerstore is a company that's built batteries in Ontario and Quebec, and they've got a battery project ready for Trenton that they've priced at roughly 50% cheaper than what the Nova Scotia gas plant will cost. So storage keeps getting cheaper, new gas keeps getting more expensive. And then there's just a sources slide. So that was a very, very quick overview because I wanted to be cognizant of time and a lot of room for questions and stuff. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Happy to answer any questions people have.
Wow, thank you so much, Jason. That was amazing. And I'm sure Tinette told you we recorded this. And if you can also send us your slides, that would be excellent. I'm practically speechless. I've learned a lot, and Tinette and I, she probably told you, we met with IESO and went to a couple of their public input things, and they just kept saying, batteries are too expensive. We have to focus on the best price for the consumer. And they also kept telling us, oh, the gas peaker plants are only going to run maybe 10-20% of the time, which makes no sense then that you need two or even one.
Yeah.
And what else? Yeah. Oh, and the other thing, and now you're telling us that when we most need the peaker plants, they're going to be running on diesel, not gas. Anyway.
Yeah.
So thank you for this presentation. I do have one small question before I'll turn it to other people. Please put your Zoom hand up or your real hand up if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. Can you just tell me why is it that gas is less available on cold days? Just because it lower pressure or yeah?
Yeah, sorry. It's actually an economic reason. So on the coldest days, everybody's looking for that peaker gas. So the Eastern Seaboard is almost entirely peakers all the way up that Northeastern pipeline. And so when we need it most, chances are that North England or New England and New Brunswick will need it most. And we're at the end of the line.
Right.
And the way peakers work, sorry, I could go on all day, but the way natural gas works is that you typically have to buy it ahead of time. You schedule for on the pipeline this amount of gas to be delivered tomorrow at this time. But the peakers, they're supposed to be able to spin up on 10-minute intervals. And so they won't be able to reserve gas ahead of time because we don't have any storage. And so what they'll be using is what they call line pack gas, which is somebody else has reserved the gas but not used it, and it's happened to make our way up to us. So it's crazy expensive and not guaranteed.
Wow.
There's no proponent yet to build a gas plant for which we have no gas. Is that right?
Yes. That's exactly
okay.
Right.
So as I said to Tinette, this may be too much optimism, but I'm having to think, my God, I cannot imagine a business that wants to make money going in for that. Now we can't rely on that, but I'm like really? This is going to happen?
It's
Not that
this.
we don't argue against it, but it's just like, who can we find who's smart? And it may just be talking to the company. It's just like, are you guys crazy? Like, who would spend their money on this?
It's so you've hit the nail on the head because it doesn't make any economic sense from a buyer's perspective, but
Yeah.
it's a very sweet deal from the gas plant perspective in that they're getting paid based on capacity. So they're getting paid to be able to generate 600 megawatts, whether they generate it or not. So we're going to be paying up to 140 million, maybe up to 200 million a year, just to have these plants sitting on the ground idle.
So I guess the best thing we can say is if they're idle, that's not dangerous from a health perspective.
Exactly.
I guess,
Exactly.
like, anyway, thank you. I'm just shaking my head.
None of it makes any sense. They're telling us we need this backup power, but we never ever want to use it. It's like, well, maybe we could find a way to not have it and then never want to use it. Like.
And how is paying for something that you're not using good for the ratepayers, like, which is their basic argument?
Exactly. And one of the things we've been poking at is we're going to be paying based on the 600 megawatt. What if our need is only 300 megawatt? Right. Then we're really just throwing money away, for a backup capacity that we're well overbuilt.
I wonder, Jason, if I think you're familiar with the plant in Ontario that said it was going to be a peaker plant and it seems to run 24/7, 365. Can you speak to that at all?
Exactly. Yep. That plant is exactly what happened. It was built as a peaker, and its initial lifetime ran less than 15% of the time. But the last number of years, it's been over 85 and up to 90% of the time. And the reason that happened is because Ontario had another couple of projects that went south, and all of a sudden, what they had estimated as a peaker became a baseline plant. And the concern is Nova Scotia is going to do the exact same thing, where we talk about coming off of coal. And it's true, we are coming off of coal, but we have 8 coal plants in Nova Scotia. 4 of them are being closed, and 4 of them are being converted to heavy fuel oil. One of them is actually natural gas. But the idea is that half of our thermal baseline capacity is going away, and we're replacing that with peakers. And so we suggest that it's not going to be a peaking mechanism at 3 to 15% of the time. It's going to be 25% or more because of how they're positioned to replace the coal coming offline. But that's exactly the concern. And so people living beside them in Ontario have no recourse or alternative, because whether it runs 3% or 90% of the time, it's up to the energy operator, which is the IESO in Ontario, which the IESO in Nova Scotia is modeled after.
The IESO, for anyone who doesn't know, is the Independent Energy Systems Operator.
Sorry, and I should have started with that because that's a very recent change in Nova Scotia Power's generation. So it used to be just Nova Scotia Power. They took care of generation, transmission, and everything. And now that responsibility has been split into Nova Scotia Power is still responsible for 90+% of our generation, but there's another new, supposedly independent organization called the IESO that's supposed to manage power producers and how much energy is put onto the grid and manage the grid going forward. In theory, it makes a lot of sense. However, the way they've been going about it, it's not independent. It's mostly Nova Scotia Power execs and thermal generation folks. So they know what they know. They don't know batteries.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just want to mention one other thing that came from the conversation Kathy and I had with Aaron Long, who's the project manager for this, with the IESO. And I said to him, what happens when 25 years are up? And he said, well, we could, if there's a need for it, we can ought to extend the contract, renegotiate the contract. And I said, okay, what if that's doesn't work out? And he said, well, they could find another buyer. So Nova Scotia could be saddled with 2 gas plants that are, serving some other jurisdiction's electrical needs, or a private, AI data center or something like that. So it isn't a bridge. It's kind of like definitely going down a rabbit hole.
It's a really good point. What they call this period right now, and it's happening across Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta, New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, they call it the last chance for gas, because this is literally the last chance that these operators are going to get to build a gas plant. If it goes past 2035, no chance they ever get built. And so this is why we're getting 600 megawatts instead of the 150 megawatt that they said they needed, is because if they build it now, they get it, and they won't ever have a chance to do it in the future. So it's really kind of sad that they're all seeming to take advantage of these loopholes to get them in. And the concern is that, yeah, they're 25-year contracts, but probably year 10, battery technology catches up, other technology catches up, and all of a sudden they're too expensive to run. And so we're still paying capacity payments based on a thing that we're never actually going to run. And again, that's a good thing from an environmental perspective, but it's horrible from economical. So.
And also from the taxpayers, we're paying for it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
And they're the main part of their argument is economic. So yes.
One of the things that I'm hoping we can do a bit more going forward is team up with Cape New Brunswick and work together on this, because Cape New Brunswick has been fighting a gas plant there that's actually on the Chignecto Isthmus between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So maybe I'll let Harold speak for a moment to those efforts.
I don't have much to add, but thank you for the invitation, and thank you for your presentation, Jason. And the arguments that we've been hearing from various experts, both Francophone and English speaking in New Brunswick, are exactly the same, and it's no wonder. Just for your information, we are mounting a legal challenge against the project in Tantramar. The interveners who presented to the Energy Utility Board found that the arguments for this proposed plant were not solid and not well presented, but also not well researched, and no consideration given, or not enough consideration given to other options. So I spoke to the intervener, and just on a pessimistic note, he thinks that the chances of the proposed gas plant in Tantramar being stopped are very small, and I'm incredulous about that, because of the arguments presented in every which way, whether it's economics or health, or whether it's the environment, the moose, the salmon, it doesn't matter which way you look at it. And given what the options are, and given that we've been misled to think that this is really a transition to renewables when there's no discussion about renewables themselves, it seems inconceivable that the chances are so small that this project here in Tantramar can be stopped. But there we are. My question to Jason, if I may, is a little bit more emphasis on battery charging with regard to wind and solar. Where do you see that?
Yeah, so I've been following the Tantramar stuff very, very closely, because I think that's exactly what's going to happen in Nova Scotia in terms of, being the same proponent, pro energy, offering the exact same solution, right up until the point where they had to pivot to the dry tech. So that may throw a bit of a wrinkle in there, but yeah, so With respect to renewables on the grid, I think it's important to what they call a diversity benefit. And so the new Nova Scotia ELCC report that came out offered a modest diversity benefit. And what that means is that when you look at a renewable, solar, wind, and battery in isolation, they have what's called an electric load carrying capacity for each of them. And it all depends on your grid configuration, how that percentage shakes out. But the important part to know is that renewables backed by storage have a greater ELCC than any individual component of that system. And it's because wind and renewables like solar can charge batteries on off-peak times. And so really, I call them time machines for power, and they can take low-cost power and charge the batteries and then discharge them when it would have been a higher cost peak power. So it's really kind of a time transport for money. But especially in Nova Scotia, and I think New Brunswick's similar, is we're forecasted to be almost 30% curtailed in our wind. And what that means is that we'll have at various times 30% more wind than we actually need. And so we'll have to tell turbines to shut off, and they just spin freely and they don't generate electricity. But if we had storage, we could use that curtailed electricity to actually charge the batteries. And then we're at zero cost charging, right? Like, you know, we're really taking energy that we would have thrown away anyway and using that for battery charging. So what we complain about is that the IESO hasn't done the modeling to show the diversity benefits from having all of these renewable inputs plus storage on the grid. And does that answer your question, Harold? I mean,
It does.
okay.
Can you explain a little bit what the waterless, I don't understand that. And perhaps you could take a minute to just tell me how you can manage these plants without water.
Yep, sure thing. And so there's two ways to go about it. One is to use basically a reciprocating engine design, which is the same as your car, and it uses a closed loop coolant. And so in a similar way that your car radiator system works, they pour water in, it circulates around the engine, and then it keeps the engine cool that way. That's with a technology called RICE. That's not the technology that's been chosen for Tantramar. And Tantramar, and what we think is going to happen in Nova Scotia, is they're using what are called Aero CTs, which are basically refurbished airplane engines where they just take them off the wing, put them on blocks, and then attach a generator to them. That's what we're getting. And so there's really three parts to them. One part is the combustor, which is where the fuel is actually burnt. Then there's the generator, and then there's the exhaust stack. The dry technology refers to the combustor part. And so the cheapest way to build a combustor is to build what's called a wet combustor. And it uses a ton of water, like 7 million liters of water a day that it injects during the ignition process and when the fuel is actually being burnt. And what that does is keeps the heat down and helps control emissions. Crazy water expensive. The dry version of that uses no water at all, but it actually uses finer nozzle control to burn at a hotter temperature so that it doesn't require the same amount of water to keep the emissions down. So it's kind of similar to like a carburetor in a car versus a tuned fuel injected engine. So, you know, the wet combustor would be the carburetor, and the dry combustor would be the highly tuned fuel injected version of that.
Okay, thank you.